Good morning. Our reading this morning is from Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12 and 21 to 24. Should you wish to follow in the Pew Bible, it can be found on page 936. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, 'Raka,' is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift."
This past February, I did something I'd never done before as a preacher, and it may have been a first for you. All of February, we celebrated Black History Month. I'd never done that before. It had probably never even really crossed my mind before, but my time in Chicago has shown me the importance of recognizing things like that. And so about halfway through February, as we were focusing on Black history and Black reality today, it occurred to me that I had never celebrated Black history or paid much attention to it in my preaching. I had never paid any attention to First Nations people in my preaching. And so today I want to begin to correct that oversight. How many of you have heard of Pauline Johnson? Wow. Yeah, good. We can have her picture up there on the screen. Pauline Johnson was half First Nations, half European in her heritage. She was born in the Brantford area. When she grew up, she became a poet, and she performed her poetry across Canada. She was born in 1861. She ended up dying in British Columbia in 1913. When I was about 13 or 14, my parents were talking to me one day, and they explained that I was related to Pauline Johnson. It just so happened that I was going to a middle school, grade 6, 7, and 8, and the school, there was a primary school right beside our middle school, which was named Pauline Johnson Primary School in Hamilton. And there's a number of schools throughout the Brantford, Hamilton, Burlington area named after Pauline Johnson. But as I was saying, when I was about 13, my parents explained to me that we had a connection with Pauline Johnson. That, that my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had been a Johnson, and we were connected. And being a 13-year-old, I was only sort of half listening. But when I remember going to my room later that day and thinking about that and realizing that I had some First Nations blood in me, which was a complete surprise to me, because my dad had always said, he was 100% English, and my mother had said she was Scottish and Newfie, which is, and so it really, that's not a slight to the noose. But they came from various parts of Britain, obviously, or France. And so as I began to think about the fact that I was a descendant of Pauline Johnson and had some First Nations blood into me, that really just sort of, I found it rather uncomfortable. I found that, I'd had some attitudes about, Indian people. I'd had a few in my classes. They tended to be a little disruptive. I didn't have any First Nations friends. And I found it just kind of uncomfortable. It didn't sit right with me that I would be part First Nations. A day or two later, I raised this again with my parents, and they explained that, no, we were not a blood relative of Pauline Johnson, but my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Johnson had been her godfather, or actually had been her grandfather's godfather, which is where the Johnson name came into it. And so I was greatly relieved that I truly was English and Scottish and Newfoundlandese. And I don't say that proudly now. I say that with some shame and embarrassment that I had been so upset and troubled by the fact that I may have had some Indigenous heritage in me. I think we can all admit that we've experienced racism in Canada. When we meet people who are a different ethnicity than us, we may be very polite, we may be very Canadian in how we relate to those people, but we know that when we are off by ourselves or with other people who are like us, that we can say or think some very negative things about First Nations people. I want to begin to address that today. You may have heard back a month or two ago about the statue of John A. Macdonald that was removed from outside of City Hall in Victoria, BC. Obviously a very contentious issue, people very strongly on both sides. If you're, think that that was a horrible thing to do, you may not understand the full picture, because I think if you understand the full picture and where some other people are coming from, you would find it hard to be all pro or all con on that decision. For the last number of months, we know that there's been a huge uproar about what the US government has been doing at their southern border, separating parents from children as those migrants have come across the border. And we say, how can you do that? Obviously, there's a problem there that needs to be addressed, but why would you separate parents and their children, especially the tiny ones? But we realize that that's exactly what the government of Canada did for about 150 years, separating First Nations children from their parents. I'm talking, of course, primarily about residential schools. We have a long and ugly history of residential schools here in Canada. I want to show you a few pictures. These are paintings by Kent Monkman, First Nations artist, and I hope these are turning out fairly well for you. How children were seized by both the authorities and by religious leaders, taken away from their homes, taken away from their parents, from their communities, and forced to go to residential schools. I've got a few more by Kent Monkman here. I'll just let you look at those briefly. We see the next slide, Spencer? So here are some historic pictures. These are boys living at their residential school. You can see that space is quite cramped, that there are dozens of them in the same room. Next picture. Girls brushing their teeth around a sink. No longer allowed to speak their own languages, no longer allowed to wear their own clothing, forced to be away from their parents at such a young age, forced to wear unfamiliar clothing, to learn an unfamiliar language. Next picture. This is a residential school, the large building in the background, a residential school in Saskatchewan. And you can see at the front of the picture there are some First Nations adults who have come and set up camp to try to be closer to their children. The authorities have taken their children away from them. They've taken them to this school, and so naturally, like any of us, the parents are very distraught by that. And so these parents have come and set up their homes, their tents outside of the residential school, hoping to be able to spend some time with their children. Many in the government advocated that the school should be even farther away from each community so that the parents wouldn't be able to do this. Next picture. This older First Nations man is holding a sign. We were a part of the Canadian Holocaust. Now, when we think of the Holocaust, of course, we think of what the Germans did to the Jews and others throughout Europe during the Second World War. I can certainly admit that what was done and the scale of it was much smaller than that. You know, we weren't putting people in gas chambers. But this is the Canadian equivalent of the Holocaust, what we have done to our First Nations sisters and brothers. This man is one of the survivors. And here's a very interesting statistics. If you served in the military during World War II, you had a 1 in 26 chance of not coming home. 1 out of every 26, mostly men and a few women who enlisted in the Canadian services, 1 out of every 26 lost their lives. An even greater number, 1 out of every 25 children that went to residential school lost their life at school because of abuse, mistreatment. I don't even want to begin to think how 1 out of every 25 children would die at school. That's statistics from the CBC. Our closest residential school wasn't too far away, just 25 minutes on the Oneida Reserve. There were 80 residential schools across the country, and almost all of them were run by Christians. 1 out of every 25 children died at the hands of Christians. Out of those 80 schools, 44 were run by the Roman Catholic Church in Canada. 21 were run by the Anglican Church of Canada. 13 by us, the United Church of Canada. And 2 by the Presbyterians in Canada. 80 schools. Over those 100+ years, approximately 150,000 children taken from their homes, forced to go to one of these schools. Do you know what year it was when the last of the residential schools closed? I see one person nodding. Don't say it. Most of you don't, I assume. I didn't. I had no idea until I looked it up. 1996. 1996, 22 years ago. All of us, with maybe the exception of Rita, were alive 22 years ago. The last school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. This is our legacy. This is what so many of our First Nation sisters and brothers suffered through. And so I hope that sheds some light on why so many of them and their parents had such a hard time keeping jobs, going on to further education. After having to endure that, why would you want to go on to college or university? Why so many of them have problems with money, have problems with addiction, have problems in relationships, have problems with their raising their children. Their culture, their language, their heritage, their community was stripped from them for several generations. How can you expect anybody to function well after losing all of that? I want to thank Don Baker for putting me in touch with a First Nations man that he knows. Howard Elijah is a member of the Oneida settlement. Howard is, I asked him if he was or is a chief at Oneida, and he said no, there's a lot of confusion about that. He is one of the 9 deed holders. He is one of the 9 trustees who has his name on the deed for the property. And so he's not a chief, although we tend to confuse things like that, and he gets called a chief regularly. I talked with Howard earlier, at the beginning of last week, and it was a very enlightening, eye-opening conversation. He said that his main frustration, the frustration of a lot of his people, is that the government has made treaties and made promises for 300 years now, and they continue to break them. You know, at first it was going to be like, well, you know, most of Ontario is yours. You know, that's your land. And then the government broke that treaty. And as more and more Europeans have settled in various parts of Canada, you know, the treaties, new treaties had to be made because obviously the old treaties were being broken. That's his main complaint, is that the government says one thing, you know, and they say, this is what he said. He said, you know, the government will say the treaties are as good as the day they were written. But obviously they're not. You know, promises, agreements to build schools on every reserve. And there's been some where they get in there and they start to do the work and it's not going well, and so they forget about it. Clean water. The water's dirty, can't do anything about that. How horrible it is that in a country like Canada, one of the most modern, civilized countries in the world, we think, you know, we're in such good shape that there are people, Canadians, without clean water, without a healthy school to go to where the air is bad, or you know, there's still asbestos in them, or whatever the case may be. Having to be bused, you know, 2 hours each way. Horrible conditions. Is it any wonder that so many First Nations parents teach their children, don't trust the white man? Don't trust the white man, you can't trust them. It's no wonder at all. Oneida is actually not a reserve. That land was purchased by First Nations people that primarily came up from New York State, and they paid for that land. So it's improper to call it a reserve. It's a settlement. They bought the land. They own it. That's why Howard's name is on the deed. He's one of the title holders. Also, just beyond Oneida is the Chippewa of the Thames Reserve and the Munsee Delaware Reserve. Those two are reserves. Reserves are owned by government. They're government land. They've said, you know, we've got some land here and we're going to let you live on it for a while, you know, a few generations, whatever. We may change our mind. But here you go. Here's some money to build some houses, to build some roads. Howard explained to me that, you know, we hear from time to time about all these millions of dollars that are being given to First Nations people. He says that money goes to the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa, where the majority of employees are not First Nations people. You know, there's a lot of government overhead, as we would expect. And then the money, what's left of it, may come to Toronto. And from Toronto, it goes out to the various reserves and groups. And so it does very little on the ground. He told me that last year they built 2 new houses in Oneida. He said that, their roads, their community, they're not the best, but there are a lot of reserves where it's much worse than they have it. Just yesterday, this came out, it was news back about a month and a half ago, but I was maybe on vacation or in Chicago or something, so I missed it. But I just found out yesterday that the Ontario government, you've heard about the whole curriculum upheaval with the sexuality stuff. This is something slightly different than all of that. I don't want to get into that today. But the Ontario government this summer, back 6 weeks or so ago, decided that the plan that had been coming down the pipe to introduce more First Nations material into the school curriculum, grades 1 to 12, was being shelved. There had been this plan for many works to rewrite some of the curriculum about history, geography, social studies, so that all of our children and grandchildren would know more of the whole picture about Canada, our history, our peoples, our society. And the government has now shelved that idea. When I was talking with Howard, he said, when I asked him, what is the biggest problem that you run into? He said, people don't understand us. They don't know who we are. And I think that's very true. I know it was true for me, certainly, up until I started preparing this message. We know very little about our sisters and brothers. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, Greg, I feel for these people. I feel badly for them, what was done to them, what some of them are having to endure today. But I didn't do that to them. That's not my fault. That was, generations ago. Governments and people that, I can't have any control over. And I don't take any responsibility for that behavior, which was obviously not mine. I can understand why you might think that. I want to focus for a few minutes on Jesus' words. Jesus says, if you are offering your sacrifice in the temple, and you remember that you've got something against your brother, leave your gift there and go to your brother and make amends with him first, and then come back and offer your gift in the temple. Is that what Jesus said? That's what I thought Jesus said until I looked at that passage more closely. That's not what Jesus said. Did I trick you? Jesus said this. He said, if you are offering your sacrifice at the temple and you remember that your brother has something against you, not the other way around, but if your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice and go to your brother and work it out. Ask for forgiveness. Apologize. Make amends. If your brother has something against you, before you come back and make your offering to the Lord. We may be sitting here thinking, I haven't done anything. I haven't put these people on reservations. I haven't, robbed them of their land, robbed them of their language, their culture. I don't have anything against those people. Live and let live. But Jesus says to us, if they have something against us, and we can understand why they have something against us, because we're allowing the system to continue. So we need to be the ones to go, to listen, to learn, to apologize, to work with them, to make things better, to make things right, to make things just. That is God's vision for all of humanity. The kingdom of God is about love and justice and forgiveness, where people are treated fairly, where those that are in need are helped, where the strong advocate on behalf of the weak. All of those things, as Christians, we are called to do. I commend you, Byron United Church. You have a tremendous ability to help people. Whether that's bringing Syrian refugees to the safety of London, whether it's in, providing food for those in our own city that need it, the Christmas shoe boxes, the help with Delta at Beth Emmanuel Church, the Sock It To Them Sunday. I could go on and on and on, the milk bag mats, about the ways that you are generously meeting people's needs. That's awesome, and that so needs to continue. But there's more to justice than that. I want to show you this table. All of those wonderful ministries that we engage in are acts of service, where we're helping others. We do for others, but that often dehumanizes others. And you know what it would be like to have to go to a food bank, to have to go to a church, to go to a minister, whether you know them or not, and say, I can't pay my bills this month. Can you give me some money? I'm desperate. That is so dehumanizing. It's necessary at times, and we want to be able to help people. And we do all of those wonderful things to make sure people are not going hungry, that people have a place to sleep, that their heat's not being turned off, that they can come to the safety of Canada. Whatever the case is, we do so many of those things so well. But I'm afraid that we haven't been doing much in terms of working for justice. We haven't been advocating and working together to change the system that leads to this poverty in the first place. And rather than doing that for people, like giving a handout, that's something that we can do with people. We can do it with our First Nations sisters and brothers. We can stand beside them. We can, raise our placards with them. We can write letters with them. And that restores a dignity, a sense of self-worth to anybody that we love and wish to help. Just give me 1 second here. I want to give you the example of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. We know this. Jesus tells this fictional story, presumably fictional, about this man who is traveling down a road and he gets attacked and robbed and beaten up and left for dead. And these people come by, and the first two don't help him, and the third person, the Samaritan, stops and helps him. Service is like stopping and helping the person who is in need. And that is so important and necessary in our world where so many people have needs. Justice would be then, after you've helped that person, to go and say, why is this happening? Why are people getting robbed on this road? What can we do to change that system? Why are people attacking and robbing other people? Are they in poverty themselves, that they feel they have no other way to put food on their table than to steal from others? And working to change that system. That is the kingdom of God. And we are called to be engaged in both service, meeting tangible, physical, immediate needs, as well as advocating for justice in our society, so that there can be reconciliation, so that there can be restoration, that all might live in a land of prosperity and peace. It's easy to start talking, thinking in that us-them mentality. We need to let that go. We are all one. Regularly, here at Byron United Church, we pray for persecuted Christians around the world. Christians who've been put in prison, in labor camps, who will never see the light of day again. We pray for them, and they need our prayers. And despite what has been done by the church to so many of these First Nations people, they too are our sisters and brothers in Jesus Christ. They are believers. And they are so close, and yet persecuted and marginalized by us, the rest of Canada. There is no us and them. We are all Canadians. We are all sisters and brothers. And we need to recognize that. The United Church has been at the forefront of trying to bring about reconciliation and restoration with First Nations people. In 2012, 6 years ago, they changed the United Church crest. I'll show that to you here on the screen. They made two significant changes. You'll see the four colors, the white, red, gold, and black. Those are traditional colors of many First Nations people in North America. They inserted those four colors into those four fields. They used to just be a blue background before. There's wording down where it says, all my relations. There's lettering there that's been added onto the edge of the crest in the Mohawk language, which translates as all my relations. A phrase common to so many First Nations people to describe the fact of what I just said, that we are all sisters and brothers. And that we need to treat each other with that same love and respect and understanding and forgiveness, just like we try to do with members of our immediate family. Over 30 years ago, the United Church issued an apology to First Nations people. An apology about the residential schools, apology about all the ways that they've been mistreated and marginalized by us, by the United Church of Canada. And yet, I confess that throughout all of these, I have been silent. I have said so little. The government has, launched the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. The government has apologized from time to time. The government is working as best government can. There's always room for improvement. And yet, throughout all of that, I have never, ever preached a sermon on my First Nations sisters and brothers. I apologize. Obviously, today is the beginning of a new chapter. I want to share with you, this is a passage out of the United Church Apology. We tried to make you be like us. We tried to make you be like us. And in so doing, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you were. Powerful, because it's so true. Next slide. All United Church congregations are encouraged at the beginning of every Sunday's worship service, every week, to acknowledge the land that their church is built on. Some churches, like ours, is on land that was established as a part of a treaty. We own it. There are other United Churches that are built on land that was never a part of a treaty, unceded land. But we are all encouraged to acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered here today at Byron United Church is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, and Wendat peoples. London, because of the river, because of the forks of the Thames, was a gathering spot for many different First Nations tribes. They would come, they would exchange goods, they would get to know one another here in the London area because of the Thames. And so that's why there are 4 nations listed. Jesus says, if your brother holds something against you, leave your gift at the temple, go and make amends with your brother. Jesus goes on to say in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We need to be a part of bringing about that kingdom, about having God's will take place in the parts of the world that we can have some influence on. I don't have a solution. There is no easy answer. There's no quick fix. I can't offer you that today. But I can celebrate with you. I celebrate the fact that the residential schools are closed, and we're not doing that anymore. And I invite you with me to begin to listen to the stories and experiences of those that went through that trauma of residential schools, that we might better understand and care. I celebrate the fact that Oneida, there's a learning center so that the young people and people of all ages can learn their own language, can experience their own culture, learn their own traditions. I celebrate that they have that opportunity. And I invite you to join with me in that celebration, to pray for God's blessing upon them, upon us. And I celebrate the fact that the federal government is planning to create a new national holiday that recognizes the residential school legacy, that marks that, makes every Canadian very aware of the fact that this is a part of our history. And this is why our country is so torn. You may have the opportunity to have some conversation with somebody, and they might say, this new federal holiday and blah, 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 the Indians. You have the opportunity to say, this is important. And so I invite you to join with me in that, in standing with our First Nations sisters and brothers, standing up for who they are, what they need, what they deserve. Blessed are the righteous. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Amen.